Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I'm going to be breaking down a fight night fight. Now, this is something I just found out about, but apparently it's been going for about a year now. It is a German, I guess, promotion, you could call it, where they pit two really high-level fencers against each other, but they put them in a format where they have them fight for 3 2-minute rounds with a pretty normal HEMA-style 2.1-point rule set. I find this pretty exciting because this is the kind of thing that people have talked about doing in the past, but I had never seen really implemented. So it's pretty exciting for me to be able to review a fight where the full intention was not to host a tournament, but to simply host two really good fencers and have them fight it out for a while so that you can really get a good sense of how each one adapts to the other person. Now, this is obviously not something you can do in most tournaments because it just takes too damn long, but it is something you can do on its own. At the exact same time, Ardo Fama, one of the fighters in this, is actually coming to do a seminar in Columbus, Ohio really soon, so I figured it would be a good time to not only review Fight Night, but also review Ardo Fama. So, this is just the first round of 3 that he had against his opponent, and in this particular case, we see a lot of really cool and unique fencing from Ardo and adaptations that can really help you understand how he fences and how you could potentially fence if you wanted to copy him. So for this first exchange, we come right out of the gate swinging, and Ardo does a move that I consider a classic in his style, which is he steps out of his corner in a one ox, and then he winds into another ox, immediately throws a thrust, which lands, and looks like it mostly manages to zone out the opposing cut. Now, this is a staple of Ardo's fighting style, and another one of those instances where I would say is an example of someone breaking the rules of general kinds of fight safety in order to get an advantage. Now, normally, I would say to any new fencer or even moderately experienced fencer that changing guards meaninglessly outside of range is just a waste of time. However, if you, like Ardo, have a really good understanding of distance, there is a little trick you can play when changing guards from outside range. And that is if you do exactly what Ardo does here and change guards exactly as you step into range. The reason this is better is that if you're changing guards outside range, well, it doesn't matter. Your opponent is just going to try to adjust their strategy to whatever guard you happen to have when you do enter real fencing range. But by changing the guard and stepping into range at the exact same time, what you're essentially doing is giving yourself an opportunity to change into a guard and then immediately throwing an attack, which means your opponent doesn't really have any time to make that adjustment. They have to look at exactly what you changed into right up until the moment they attack, and that might have shortcutted them maybe a second or two of thought that doesn't allow them the kind of reaction to, prepare a defense in advance. At the exact same time, Ardo is really good at thrusting from ox, and that's not a place that a lot of people thrust from because it's a little bit difficult to get your arms in alignment, it's hard to extend, it's hard to lunge, and in this particular case, that the reason this works for Ardo is because he walks in his thrusts with his feet, which is a really great idea if A, you want to keep your point online, and B, if you want to make sure that after you land your thrust, you are in a range for something else and something a little bit more tighter ranged, which we're going to see in the next couple exchanges. Now, for this next exchange, we see another really common follow-up to any kind of thrust. Although, another thing I want to point out about this isn't just the fact that Arto does a really nice job sverking and grappling out of his missed thrust, but the fact that he threw his initial thrust with what I would consider no real intent to land, but an intent to get a really strong and dominant bind. If you watch this slowly, what you're noticing here is that Ardo threw his thrust offline at almost like a 45-degree angle up and to the left in order to shove his crossguard directly into the incoming cut that he saw his opponent throwing. And the reason to do this is, of course, A, to make sure that their cut lands directly in the crossguard where you have the absolute most control over your opponent's blade, but also because it allows him to shove his hands predominantly high up and get them into a position where he can throw a right Zverkow, where normally a right Zverkow might be a little bit challenging. One thing that happens quite a lot when you throw a thrust is that you generally throw it from your shoulder toward the shoulder line of your opponent, which means that when you get set off to either side, your arms can get very easily tangled up in the arms of your opponent, meaning that once you're a little bit tangled up, trying to bring your hands high and getting that Zverkow low towards the target that you want to hit it with can get very, very messy. And if you want to make sure that your Zverkows don't end up messy, this is one really great way to get it to work. Even though you are the one moving forward, and there is really no reason that your opponent won't just stand still and get in the way, throwing your initial thrust offline and towards your opponent's sword arm or just sword dominant side is going to get you a situation where you can easily just move your arm straight up into the air and get them out of the way where they can get tangled up with your opponent. It also means you're going to be in a position already where you can start throwing your Zverkows a little bit low and maybe still aim them at the head, neck, or even armpit line of your opponent rather than down towards the body. This isn't just because sometimes body cuts are only worth 1 point, but also because at the end of the day, if you're going to do the follow-up to the follow-up, which is what Ardo does here at the end with the grappling, you're going to want to make sure your hands are in a really good position for that as well. So with this simple setup of just thrusting offline with the intent to miss, Ardo sets up his following 2 parts of his exchange and gets into a really good position to execute both of them should one and then the other fail. So for this third exchange, we see the grapple section of Ardo's 1, 2, 3 step process really play out in full. And although I'm kind of jumping around in the timeline here for this particular fight, I thought it was important to go over the wrestling portion of this third step because it's important to understand what kinds of things Daniel is trying to adapt against throughout the entirety of the rest of the fight. So in this particular exchange, Ardo comes in with what looks like a cut to the top, but it also looks like another situation where he didn't really intend for it to land. Instead, he went for a kind of Zornhau cut towards his opponent's blade and wanted to get into that really dominant position. Now, in any situation where you're coming forward at your opponent essentially has 2 choices. They can either go forward or they can go backwards. And in a sense, Daniel does neither of those, but he stands still. And in the world of you coming forward at somebody, standing still is effectively the same as going forward. So for this particular exchange, unlike the last 2 where we saw Daniel moving backwards in order to try to gain distance, because he stands still, Ardo has the ability to go into full grapple mode. And he does a very smart thing here, which is he takes his left hand and he tries to put it over the top of both of his opponent's hands. The reason this is smart, of course, is that if you only use one hand to tie up 2 hands, well, then they can't do much about it. But it's also the fact that when Daniel inevitably lets go with his non-dominant hands and tries to use it to defend himself from Ardo's incoming attack, the result is an overhook, meaning Ardo's left arm is over the top of Daniel's right arm, is a situation that is really, really dominant for a couple of reasons. One, an overhook allows you to pull the arm down, which frees up any space you might have to throw an attack over to the top. In boxing or MMA, this isn't maybe the greatest thing of all time, but in sword fighting, it's really great because you have a 3-foot pole on your other hand that you can use to kind of teep over the top. The other thing that's going on here, of course, is that as soon as Daniel lets go with his left hand, he immediately starts trying to send it towards Ardo's right hand. Because despite the fact that that is a 3-foot stick you can use to hit somebody, you have to hit them with the end of the 3-foot stick, which means you need to extend your arm all the way out to one side in order to get the space that you need to throw either a thrust or a cut. So, this overhook that Ardo got in the first instance does 2 very crucial things for preventing his opponent from getting close enough to him to stop what's happening. One, an overhook allows you to kind of draw your opponent's arm across their body, and this makes it a little bit difficult to get your other arm across your body to try to stop the thing. So you imagine your left arm is pinned like this, and you're trying to reach across with your right arm. It's really hard to do. That being said, another crucial thing that happens here is that a big mistake that a lot of people make in HEMA grappling is that they leave their back open. Now, if you watch the first couple seconds of this exchange with the grapple, Ardo puts his arm over both arms. And you might say, for instance, let's say, for example, that Daniel freed up his right arm and immediately wrapped it around the backside of Ardo. This would be a kind of side control position, what you might call in wrestling or grappling, and it's not a very dominant position for either person. However, in the world of HEMA, we have to put our weapons in our dominant hands, and that completely restricts our ability to let go of our weapon, which is pretty much our only way to score points, and then move our arm into that position. It also means that Ardo had the dominant side on that control position, it also meant that he could have let go with his left arm and gone around to take the back, because at this point, Daniel had no control over Ardo's left arm at all. So if you want the kind of rule of thumb here, in order to take someone's back, you need to have an open space to go through, and generally someone's arm is the primary thing keeping you from doing so. So if you want to try doing these kinds of grapple maneuvers yourself, remember that all three of these little points are important to make this kind of grapple/disarm play work. One, you probably need to hook either over or under, though preferably over, your opponent's dominant blade arm. If you can get that done, the next thing you need to prioritize is freeing up your dominant sword arm. If you have to then pull that away as far as you can from your opponent, consider rotating towards the arm that you controlled, or maybe even moving to take the back. After you've gotten to that point, you can either deliver a pommel strike to the head if their dominant arm or non-dominant arm isn't really fishing for it, or go for a thrust to the chest, or if you're going to be really cheeky, a shallow little cut to the leg. All of these options are perfectly viable, and in my opinion, this is the demonstration here of not only Ardo's fighting style, but a very KDF-centric fighting style. The idea here is that you want to have your good opening attack from maximum range. In this case, it was Ardo's thrust. You want to have your good mid-range closing skill type, which is your Zverkows and your Zvercopters. And then, if you manage to get all the way close enough to get there, you want to have your grapple. And in this case, you need your overhooks and your presentations of thrusts or pommels. Put all three together and you have a really nice setup for all three ranges of fencing and for all comers and all fencing styles. However, as we're going to see in the next couple, there are some aspects that are challenges that you need to overcome if you're going to try out this style. So we're done talking about Ardo for the time being, and it's Daniel's turn to look good in the spotlight. So one of the big adaptations that Daniel made throughout this fight in order to try to counter Ardo's fencing style was to throw hand shots while slightly out of measure. If you remember back when I talked about Ardo's first exchange, I said that one of his big tells or big exchange openers is that he will transition to a guard and then throw a big attack, deep attack out of that guard. In the first exchange, it was going from an ox to an ox and throwing a thrust. And you'll see him here in other transitions going from a plow to a plow and throwing a cut, or a plow to an ox and throwing a cut. This is a pretty typical thing that you see in the KDF texts, and it's pretty bread and butter style. However, there is a little bit of a flaw. And the flaw is that as you're transitioning guards, as much as you might think you're out of range, sometimes you're actually not quite out of range. And the reality is that when you're transitioning guards, your hands are almost always open. So, Daniel's first and most effective adaptation throughout this fight was to make sure that every single time Ardo transitioned guards when he wasn't quite in the right position, he got punished for it by a hand shot. And the reason these hand shots are going to find their mark 9 times out of 10 is because the very emphasized and maybe even exaggerated guards that Ardo likes to go into do a much better job of protecting the head and the torso than they do of the hands. Meaning that if you throw some cheeky little horizontal hand cuts, it's often that you're going to be able to hit Ardo during his transition and then maybe even have the opportunity to cover the afterblow because he's going to have to finish his guard transition before he can throw a follow-up attack. Now, another adaptation that we saw from Daniel here is one that's going to be a little bit less obvious to a lot of people, but in my opinion, it's one of the things that oftentimes separates good fencers from great fencers. And like I talked about earlier, a lot of it comes down to knowing when to break the rules. Now, most people will tell you, and myself included, that you should always fence exactly like Ardo does here, with your weight directly over your feet, evenly distributed, and your body straight up into the air. And the reason for this is that, much like in other combat sports, you want that even distribution so that you can move in any direction at any time at command when the need arises. However, there is a little bit of an exception to this, and that is what we see Daniel doing here. The reason Daniel wins this kind of parry riposte exchange isn't necessarily because he had tighter footwork or faster blade work, but because he was moving in such an unusual position that Ardo seemed to not quite understand what his range and distance was from these positions. And the thing here is that if you always fence like Ardo does, you're going to have very good command of distance, timing, and blade work. But you're going to find sometimes that, much like he found himself here, hit in unusual places from unusual positions by your opponent who knows exactly how far they can go and how far they can push the envelope as far as structured positions go and still effectively fight. If you've ever fought an Olympic fencer or an ex-Olympic fencer before, you know exactly what I'm talking about. A lot of people would consider the lunge, the really deep Olympic fencing lunge, to be a compromised position, and it is. But if you can effectively fight, even moderately out of that position, you often have something of a trump card or a surprise in store for your opponent. Because if you are the one person on earth who can lunge that deep and still stand straight up right out of it, you're going to be able to put yourself in positions that are very unusual for your opponent. Is going to put your head and torso into positions that they're not necessarily frequently common for dealing with, and you're going to be able to throw attacks from that position that come in at unusual angles and are very difficult to block. So, in my opinion, the reason Daniel came out on top in this particular instance is that he knew exactly when to throw what looked like an overcommitment, only to be able to pull himself out of it at the last second, exactly when he needed to, and to throw that follow-up cut straight to the torso that looks like it just got past Ardo's defense for no more of a reason than it was so unusual that he just didn't expect it. So now that I'm kind of done outlining people's individual styles, we're going to go a little bit more of a play-by-play. And in this particular exchange, we see another slight adaptation from both opponent in that they're both trying to figure out how to capitalize on the parry repost mid-game. Now, as we saw before, Ardo loves his Zwerghaus, but one of the issues of Zwerghaus is that they actually really only work at this middle range. Too far away and your Zwerghaus just completely misses, too close and your Zwerghaus gets stuffed. And in my opinion, this is a really good demonstration of one of the slight weaknesses of this Zwerghaus style game, and that it allows your opponent a kind of choice in that if you're not actively moving forward, they can know that if they move backwards, they can ruin your Zwerghaus in one way, and if they move forwards, they can ruin your Zwerghaus in a completely different way. So what we see in this particular exchange is there's a little bit of a parry repost and an entry action. Both people stand still, and Ardo throws a slightly flat Zwerghaus straight up to the hands. But the reason it is not the greatest Zwerghaus of all time is because he had to change the range that he was trying to throw his Zwerghaus at halfway before cocking it. You can see he's up in this top right position. He looks like he wants to throw that Zwerghaus really bad, but he obviously expected Daniel to move forward with his follow-up attack, which meant that he intentionally or unintentionally shortened his Zwerghaus so much that he had to then lengthen it halfway through and ended up kind of like turning his hands in a weird position and just kind of flat slapping him on the hands. Now, in a lot of instances, this could be considered a really good move, but in my opinion, I think it was more of a mistake than an intention. And after we see this happen, Daniel comes forward with another follow-up attack toward the hands. However, thanks to the fact that Ardo had kept his stance very even and well distributed, despite the fact that he landed what he probably thought was a legitimate attack, he was still able to pull back and parry that afterblow, and then display full-on why you really want to keep your feet evenly distributed, because upon recognizing that his opponent had taken a step backwards with only their back foot, hadn't actually opened the range very much, and was able to ballistically step forward with their back foot and throw a really nice cut over the top, which comes in unopposed. At which point, Daniel tries to wind up and get it out of the way, doesn't quite make it, and then tries to go for a cheeky little head slice just to make sure he got something in there at the end. But in my opinion, this was a really great demonstration of how Ardo's fencing style can both benefit you if you're really looking for those Zwerghaus counterattacks, and more importantly, how if you adapt midstream, you can always capitalize on someone else's footwork mistakes if you keep your feet even. Next up, we have another demonstration of Daniel's hand snipe maneuvers, but also a little bit of an adaptation from Ardo here. So we see another classic setup. Ardo steps into range and immediately begins to change guards. And Daniel, recognizing this guard transition, having no real forward momentum yet, snipes Ardo right in the hands and then starts to move backwards. Now, this would normally be the end of the exchange. However, Ardo was doing a very particular kind of transition. I would almost call a Molinet in a sense. He transitioned from a right hanging parry into a low kind of Unterhau. And in doing so, recognizing that he got hit on the hands, utilizes the rest of his forward momentum to come forward and strike Daniel in the head. And the reason this worked is because A, when Daniel caught him on the hands and then moved backwards, he moved backwards and stayed in a plow position, at which point Ardo was able to throw a kind of unterhow / middle how towards the head, which was going to come in at the poorly structured portion of the blade. Also, the reason this works is that Daniel necessarily tried to stop as soon as he felt contact and didn't necessarily fence to the halt, which is something that I advise against most of the time. So, if you're looking to try to duplicate this kind of thing, one, again, you have to make very, very sure that every time you're stepping forward, you're presenting some kind of threat. Otherwise, they are 100% going to snipe you in the hands or the legs, and you're going to pay for it every single time. However, if you can get somebody into this hand sniping game, one very viable way to try to counter it is to make sure that every time you come forward, you are presenting something toward a high priority target. Because regardless of whether or not you think it's sporty bullshit or not, if you can come forward and hit a deep target and get 2 points every single time you swing your sword, it doesn't matter how many times someone is going to hand snipe you, chances are you're going to come out on top 60% of the time. Next up, we have an exchange that's a little bit messy, but it's messy also because I think both fencers thought that they landed something and stopped and then had to continue once they realized that no, the director didn't actually call a halt yet. And normally this is the kind of exchange that I just skip. However, there's a little bit right at the end that I think is really important to cover, and that is another counter to Zverkov's, specifically, again, in their difficulty in both being a long range and a short range attack. They are really firmly seated in the mid-range category. So we see this exchange go by. There's a bit of a parry repost. Ardo comes in for an attempted thrust that gets set off, but then kind of gets stuck. It almost looks like their arms get stuck together for a couple seconds. They turn around and completely circle each other and separate, at which point Ardo throws a Zverkov towards the head. Now, normally this would be a really smart thing to do, as they just separated from the grapple, and they're probably going to be at that mid-range the Zverkov loves so much. However, it is pretty easily parried by Daniel, at which point he does a really smart mid-range to long-range attack. Namely, he parries and then reposts on the exact same side with a double hand on the sword, cut to the leg with an exit. This is really smart to do because a lot of people don't have a strategy for what happens when two people meet, somehow nothing happens, and then they get the chance to separate. That separation is very uncommon, but if you're the only one with a strategy for what happens when you separate, well, this is what can happen. In my opinion, Ardo's strategy for separation was to throw the Zverkov, but it wasn't quite as good as Daniel's strategy for separation because Ardo didn't take a step forward with that Zverkov. If he had, it would have been a completely different interaction. He probably could have Zverked his way to victory here. But because he threw that Zverk and stood stock still, basically just willing to let the exchange reset, Daniel had an opportunity where he could parry and, most importantly, throw a cut toward an extremely unparryable target and exit the exchange at the same time. Normally, a situation reserved for one-handed attacks. However, in this particular situation, and I've talked about it in another video before, it's a really, really good idea to go for the leg on a separation or some kind of one-handed cut on a separation for this exact reason. And that is, one, people are looking to reset. They're not looking to attack, and they're certainly not looking to defend something as indefensible as a leg. And most importantly, if you can capitalize on the fact that they're not going to attack, you're basically giving yourself free rein to throw the wackiest crap imaginable, and knowing that if it lands, you get your points, but if it doesn't land, chances are they're just going to stand there looking dumbfounded while you get to separate and reset back to a reasonable range. If you can do that every single time you reset an exchange, you're probably going to land most of those little one-handed crappy things. And even if it's in a tournament where they're banned and you can't do it, you can do the two-handed version like you see Daniel do here. Either way, the important aspect here is that you throw something that can't be parried in a situation where you're pretty sure your opponent is not in the mood to attack. So for our next exchange, we see Ardo here throw two Zverkovs in succession and land one of them. And many people would call this the Zornhau-copter technique, and they wouldn't necessarily be wrong. But I think people are overly dismissive of the Zornhau-copter, and most importantly, don't actually understand what it takes to set up and pay off a proper execution. And this, in my opinion, is a proper execution. So, on the one hand, you see the obvious, which is that in order to execute a Zvercopter, you throw one Zverk, and then you throw another one to a completely different target that makes them hard to parry in succession. As example here, Arto throws a low right Zverk, which gets parried, but then throws a left Zverk on the upper left side, meaning that for Daniel, he had to parry on his lower left, and then all the way up on his upper right, which is a huge amount of distance to cover. So that's why it works in this particular instance. But there's also a little bit of setup that goes into this that makes it a lot more effective. And the first thing that you see here is Ardo come in with a kind of Zornhau parry that sets up this entire interaction. The reason that Zornhau is important to this formula is because you have to get to the point where your opponent is going to parry. And one of the best ways to know that your opponent is going to parry is if they just threw an attack and it didn't land. People very typically run on this 1-2 parry repost style framework with their fencing, and for a good reason, it makes a lot of sense. This is also part of the reason why this Zvercopter can be so effective, because it capitalizes on the fact that someone's going to try to parry once, and then if they try to parry again, they're not going to make it. If they try to attack again, you're throwing a Zvercopter, which can often defend a lot of really good openings. So, if you want to set this up yourself, remember the Zornhau opener. Remember that you need to make sure that you have something to set up the defensive mindset of your opponent, whether that be an attack of your own that they parried, and now you know that they're going to throw something and you just parry that, or just any interaction where you've thrown either an aggressive attack that zoned out somebody's attack, as you see here, or just a parry in general. As a result, you also want to make sure you want to move forward with your Zvercopter, because if you stop moving forward, the interaction that can happen is that you can do what Daniel has done repeatedly during this fight, which is just back up and snipe the hands. Remember, the Zvercopter is a mid-range attack only, and if your opponent is moving backwards and you're not moving forwards, you're not going to be able to maintain that mid-range, and the second half of your Zvercopter is almost certainly going to miss. So, that is all of the interactions that have to really come together to make a Zvercopter work. I understand why some people don't like them, because oftentimes it looks like someone just comes forward and throws Zvercopters until they land one. But in this particular instance, that is not really what's happening here. This is not a suicidal interaction. This is not a suicidal attack. This is actually a very well defended attack. And if you know exactly when you can break the pattern of attack, parry, then you're going to be able to capitalize on somebody's lacking defense or inefficient offense. So this is the final exchange of the first round, and remember there are 3 rounds, so if you want to watch the video yourself, I'm going to put it down in the description. But for this particular exchange, we have another really interesting interaction. Ardo steps forward into range and puts a hard read on his opponent, who throws a big overhead attack towards Ardo's right side. He counters this by going in and stepping forward into a hanging parry, which, as you probably can guess, presents no threat whatsoever. A stepping parry is a really complicated and really risky maneuver, especially knowing how much Daniel has loved going for those hand shots in the past. But it does end up working out here. Getting that stepping forward hanging parry allows Ardo to very nicely throw what I would consider a kind of plunging cut version of a Zvercopter on his left side. Now, normally when people throw Zvercopters, they throw them along the horizontal plane. And the reason they do this is because it makes it very easy to do something like throw a Zvercopter on the lower right side and then throw a Zvercopter on the upper left side. You're going to basically go into the bottom of their hands straight to the side of their ear. But this plunging version is actually really nice because it allows you to effectively pull your hands back even further, which helps prevent getting stuffed or getting into a bad grapple. And it also makes it so that anybody who tries to throw up those classic wall parries to defend their sides from these Zvercopters, like we see Daniel do here, will often have a little bit of an angle that allows this Zvercopter to now plunge downward at a much steeper angle and crush through the weak of the sword of your opponent's block. Now, based on what I can see here, it does look like this Zvercopter lands, but in effect, it doesn't really matter whether it does or not, because what also happens after this is that Ardo is able to return to a slightly more neutral position and throw another right Zvercopter on the underside on the right side, which was just impossible to block. Daniel's response to this, which I think was just more of a reflex, is that he throws a cut straight down, which I think was really meant to be a parry, but because they're so close, ends up landing onto the hands of Ardo at the exact same time as Ardo's undersverk from the other side lands on his hands, resulting in a clash where Ardo almost loses his sword from just the force of both these attacks landing on the hands at the exact same time, going in opposite directions. A little bit of a weird exchange, but a really great demonstration of what you can do to make slight adjustments to your Zverkow game that can have really, really good payments as far as how much they can offer a resistance toward the defense and how much they can go to get a little bit wacky so that people can't defend against them quite as easily. So, like I said, that is the last exchange. I'm going to put the full video in the description. I hope you all watch it because I'm certainly going to be watching all of these night fights or fight nights, whatever they're called, because I'm really interested in this kind of format of video and also in this kind of format of not even necessarily tournament fighting, but exhibition style match. So hopefully I'll make some videos of this kind of content in the future, and I hope you all like it.